Philadelphia, 1878. The city hummed with the sound of industry, with smoke rising from chimneys and the rattle of horse-drawn carriages echoing across cobblestone streets. Gas lamps flickered against the brick buildings, throwing long shadows that stretched across alleys where whispers traveled faster than the cold wind. People gathered in clusters outside saloons, cafes, and theaters, buzzing with anticipation over something new, something strange. Flyers had been plastered across walls and lampposts, promising sights that defied belief. A name loomed larger than the print itself: T. Barnum. To many, Barnum was not merely an entertainer but a conjurer of wonders, a master manipulator of curiosity. And this time, he had brought to Philadelphia what he called the most astounding display of human oddities the world had ever seen. Crowds were already gathering, lining up to catch a glimpse of what lay behind the curtains. It wasn't just a show, it was an event, a ritual of gawking at the bizarre, the macabre, the unsettling. Inside the exhibition halls, the air was thick with the mingled scent of tobacco smoke, cheap perfume, and sweat. The atmosphere pulsed with energy, laughter mixing with gasps of horror as Barnum's carefully crafted spectacle unfolded. For the price of a ticket, men, women, and children of all social classes could peer into cages, stare at stages, and whisper to one another about the living curiosities on display. Some came with fascination, others came with fear. Most came with the hunger to be entertained by something that promised to be unlike anything they had ever seen. Philadelphia was a city of ambition, of modern science and invention, but beneath that polished exterior lay a darker craving, a desire to see what was forbidden, what was hidden, what was deemed monstrous. Barnum knew this. He built his empire on it. And in 1878, he offered the city exactly what it demanded. To call it entertainment would be to flatten its complexity. The exhibition wasn't just about laughter or amazement. It was about power. It was about the ability of the so-called normal to stare at those deemed abnormal and, for a brief moment, to feel superior. Yet there was also an uncomfortable admiration that threaded through the disgust. Barnum's human zoo, as it would later be remembered, walked the line between theatre and cruelty. The performers, living, breathing human beings, were presented as specimens, their lives condensed into stage names and exaggerated stories. A woman with a rare skin condition became the leopard lady. A man of unusually tall stature became a giant of the Orient. An indigenous family, displaced and stripped of their culture, were marketed as savages pulled from some exotic land. Their humanity was secondary, buried under the weight of spectacle and the eager eyes of the public. This was not the first time Barnum had trafficked in the bizarre, but Philadelphia in 1878 represented something larger, something darker. The show mirrored the cultural anxieties of the era, fears about immigration, fascination with science, and obsession with the boundaries of the human body. As audiences filed in, they were not just witnessing performers on a stage, they were consuming a narrative that confirmed their beliefs about difference, deformity, and destiny. The exhibition halls became a theatre of morality and mortality, of science and sin, of laughter and horror. It was a carnival where human dignity was bought and sold, packaged in bright posters and echoing applause. Barnum didn't just sell tickets, he sold stories, and the audience devoured them eagerly. And yet, beneath the gasps and the pointing fingers, there was another layer, a quiet unease. Some visitors, after leaving the exhibition, carried with them a lingering discomfort, an awareness that what they had seen was not merely a trick of illusion or a circus stunt. They had looked into the eyes of people who, outside the glare of the lamps, lived lives as complex, fragile, and real as their own. This awareness would flicker in the conscience of the city, a faint moral question mark hovering above the applause. But in the moment, that unease was drowned out by laughter, by applause, by the clicking of coins against counters. For Barnum, controversy was not an obstacle, it was fuel. He understood better than anyone that outrage sells just as well as wonder. The year 1878 in Philadelphia was, in many ways, a crossroads. The city stood as a symbol of American progress, boasting universities, factories, and theaters that embodied modern ambition. Yet Barnum's human zoo revealed something primal beneath the veneer of advancement. It exposed the human appetite for spectacle, for voyeurism, for the consumption of lives turned into curiosities. To step inside those halls was to step into a mirror, a dark reflection of society's values and its hunger for control over the unknown. And that reflection still stares back at us today, whispering questions we are not always comfortable asking. Why do we find fascination in the strange? Where does curiosity end and cruelty begin? And how much of Barnum's shadow lingers in our entertainment now? P.T. Barnum's name had already become synonymous with spectacle long before his 1878 Philadelphia exhibition, but to truly understand the scale of what unfolded there, one must first understand the man himself. Phineas Taylor Barnum was not born into wealth, nor was he destined from the start to become one of the most famous showmen in history. He was, at his core, a hustler, an opportunist with an uncanny ability to sense what the public craved, even before they knew it themselves. Born in Bethel, Connecticut, in 1810, Barnum grew up in a modest household. From an early age, he demonstrated a knack for clever schemes, often stretching the truth, or outright fabricating it, to his advantage. He once admitted openly that he thrived on humbug, a term he used not as an insult but as a philosophy. To Barnum, humbug meant selling illusions so convincingly that the audience would willingly suspend disbelief, even when they knew they were being tricked. The key wasn't the lie itself, it was the performance of the lie. Barnum's early ventures reveal much about the methods that would later define his empire. One of his first notorious successes came with the exhibition of Joyce Heth, an enslaved woman whom Barnum claimed was the 161-year-old former nurse of George Washington. In truth, Heth was barely over 80, blind, and paralyzed, yet Barnum's relentless advertising drew massive crowds eager to believe the extraordinary claim. He charged admission to see her and even continued profiting after her death, charging spectators to watch a public autopsy. It was grim, exploitative, and sensational, but it worked. The pattern was set. Barnum understood that Americans had an insatiable hunger for the strange, the grotesque, and the unbelievable, and he was more than willing to exploit it. From these beginnings, Barnum built his reputation as a master of exaggeration and reinvention. His American Museum in New York became a cultural landmark, featuring everything from taxidermied oddities and elaborate hoaxes to live performers marketed as living wonders. The museum blurred the lines between education and entertainment, presenting exhibits under the guise of science while simultaneously indulging the public's desire for the spectacular. Among his most famous attractions were the Fiji mermaid, a grotesque taxidermy fusion of a monkey's torso and a fish's tail, and General Tom Thumb, a dwarf performer who achieved international fame under Barnum's management. The success of Tom Thumb in particular revealed one of Barnum's greatest talents, transforming marginalized individuals into celebrities, while pocketing the lion's share of the profit. By the time Barnum brought his show to Philadelphia in 1878, he was no longer just a businessman, he was a cultural force. His name itself was a brand, a promise of astonishment. But what made him truly dangerous, in the eyes of his critics, was his genius for manipulating public opinion. Barnum never shied away from scandal. In fact, he welcomed it. If newspapers criticized his exhibits as frauds or labeled his methods as cruel, he seized the opportunity to double his advertising. He famously quipped, "There's no such thing as bad publicity," and he lived by those words. For Barnum, outrage was not a hindrance, it was free marketing. The louder his detractors shouted, the more curious the crowds became. Yet beneath the showmanship, there was a cold calculation. Barnum's empire thrived on the exploitation of human difference. He scoured the country, and often the world, for people whose bodies, conditions, or appearances set them apart from the norm. He recruited them, renamed them, and spun elaborate backstories designed to captivate audiences. Some performers willingly embraced this strange path to fame, earning money and recognition they might never have achieved otherwise. Others, however, were coerced, manipulated, or treated as disposable once their novelty faded. This duality, the possibility of opportunity entwined with exploitation, became the hallmark of Barnum's career. Philadelphia, a city of progress and modernity, was the perfect stage for Barnum's ambitions in 1878. He was entering the peak of his power, a figure both celebrated and reviled. To the public, he was the ultimate entertainer, a man who could transform curiosity into a full-fledged cultural event. To critics, he was a moral corrupter, someone who profited by parading human beings as curiosities and perpetuating harmful stereotypes. Yet no matter the condemnation, Barnum always seemed to come out ahead. He had mastered the art of making controversy inseparable from curiosity, ensuring that people would pay to see what was being condemned in print. Barnum's story, however, is not just about his exhibitions. It is about what he represented in the broader American psyche. He was a reflection of a society fascinated with progress yet haunted by its own insecurities. In an age of scientific discovery, industrial growth, and urban expansion, people flocked to Barnum's shows as if to reassure themselves of their place in a world changing too quickly. To see the other, whether it was a so-called savage from a distant land, a person with an unusual body, or a fabricated creature of myth, was to reinforce a sense of normalcy in themselves. Barnum's genius lay in tapping into these unspoken desires, packaging them in entertainment, and selling them back to the public at a price. By 1878, Barnum had become a paradox, a man who was both loved and loathed, a symbol of American ingenuity and of its darker impulses. His exhibitions promised wonder but also demanded complicity. To buy a ticket was to participate in the spectacle, to accept the premise that human difference was entertainment. Barnum himself was unapologetic, insisting that he gave the people what they wanted. And in many ways, he was right. The masses crowded his halls, their curiosity outweighing any moral hesitation. Philadelphia was no exception. When his traveling exhibition of oddities came to the city that year, it would mark not just another profitable venture for Barnum, but a moment in which the shadows of his philosophy, humbug, spectacle, exploitation, were cast larger than ever before. Philadelphia in 1878 was a city perched on the edge of modernity, its streets vibrating with the pulse of industry and invention. The clatter of horse-drawn trolleys mingled with the distant hiss of steam engines, while smoke from towering chimneys curled into the sky, painting the air with the unmistakable scent of coal. This was a city of contrasts, wealth and poverty, progress and decay, enlightenment and superstition, all pressed together within the confines of its crowded neighborhoods. Immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and Italy poured into the city in search of work, filling the factories that churned out textiles, steel, and machinery. The Centennial Exposition just 2 years earlier, in 1876, had cemented Philadelphia's reputation as a hub of innovation and culture, showcasing telegraphs, typewriters, and the wonders of a rapidly changing world. Yet beneath the triumph of progress lurked a restless population hungry for distraction, for novelty, for something to break the monotony of endless labor and soot-stained days. Entertainment in Philadelphia during this period reflected the city's dual nature. For the wealthy elite, theaters and opera houses provided polished performances of Shakespearean drama and European symphonies. These were the cultural sanctuaries where refinement and respectability were on full display. But for the working classes, the factory hands, the immigrants, the children who darted barefoot through alleyways, entertainment was louder, cheaper, and far more visceral. Saloons buzzed with music and laughter. Traveling circuses pitched their tents on the city's outskirts, offering acrobats, animal acts, and spectacles of strength. Dime museums displayed wax figures, stuffed animals, and oddities meant to shock and amuse. It was in this second world of popular entertainment, raw and unpolished, that Barnum's traveling exhibition would find its most eager audience. The appetite for the bizarre was not confined to America alone. Across Europe, so-called ethnological exhibitions had gained popularity, placing colonized peoples from Africa, Asia, and the Americas on display for paying audiences. These human zoos promised enlightenment under the guise of science, but they were thinly veiled spectacles of voyeurism and racism. In Philadelphia, a city with its own complex racial and cultural tensions, the arrival of Barnum's human oddities tapped directly into these existing currents of curiosity and fear. To the working-class visitor, who might never travel beyond the crowded neighborhoods of the city, Barnum offered the chance to see the world condensed into a single exhibition hall. The unfamiliar was transformed into spectacle, difference was rebranded as entertainment, and the act of staring at others became an evening pastime. It is important to understand the social pressures of the time. The late 19th century was marked by rapid urbanization and industrial growth, but also by deep anxieties about identity, class, and survival. Diseases such as tuberculosis and cholera ravaged crowded neighborhoods, leaving people desperate for explanations. Medical science was advancing but remained limited, and what could not be explained often slipped into the realm of superstition. When individuals with unusual physical traits were exhibited, whether giants, dwarfs, or those with rare skin conditions, audiences projected their fears and questions onto them. Were these people cursed? Were they evidence of God's wrath, or living proof of Darwin's unsettling theories of evolution? In Barnum's Philadelphia show, the line between science and spectacle blurred deliberately, offering audiences both amusement and a strange kind of reassurance. By staring at those deemed abnormal, they reinforced their own sense of normality. Philadelphia's newspapers also played a crucial role in shaping public opinion. Print media was thriving, and editors knew that Barnum's name sold copies. Flyers, broadsides, and articles promoted the exhibition as both an educational experience and a thrilling diversion. Reporters described the curiosities in vivid detail, often exaggerating their features or fabricating backstories to stoke public interest. The city was abuzz with chatter, on street corners, in taverns, at church gatherings, Everyone had an opinion about the show. Some defended it as harmless entertainment, while others questioned its morality. But even those who condemned Barnum's exhibition could not resist talking about it, and in doing so, they fueled its popularity. Philadelphia itself had always been a city of contradictions. Founded on Quaker ideals of tolerance and equality, it had grown into a sprawling metropolis marked by inequality and prejudice. African American residents faced systemic discrimination, immigrants were often scapegoated for economic woes, and people with disabilities or medical conditions were largely excluded from public life. Barnum's Human Zoo thrived precisely because it played upon these contradictions. By displaying those who stood outside the boundaries of societal normalcy, he offered audiences a chance to reaffirm their own place in a shifting hierarchy. To the weary laborer or struggling immigrant, the sight of someone more marginalized, more different, was both shocking and strangely comforting. The city's fascination with spectacle was nothing new. The Centennial Exposition had dazzled with its grand halls and cutting-edge inventions, but it also included exhibits that blurred the line between education and display. Visitors marveled not only at machines and fine art but also at anthropological exhibits that presented indigenous peoples and foreign cultures as curiosities. Barnum's 1878 exhibition tapped directly into this same vein, but stripped away the pretense of progress and refinement. His show was not about celebrating innovation, it was about exploiting the boundaries of human difference for profit. And in Philadelphia, a city that prided itself on progress while struggling with its shadows, the timing could not have been more perfect. As the crowds gathered in 1878, Philadelphia stood as both host and accomplice to Barnum's dark vision. The city's energy, its contradictions, and its hunger for novelty created the perfect environment for his Human Zoo to flourish. To step into the exhibition was to step into the very heart of that tension, between science and superstition, entertainment and exploitation, wonder and cruelty. And for the people of Philadelphia, those blurred lines were not just accepted, they were eagerly embraced. The phrase Human Zoo carries a grotesque weight today, but in the 19th century it was a concept disturbingly normalized, cloaked in the language of science, education, and spectacle. Its origins stretched back to Europe, where colonial powers displayed people from Africa, Asia, and the Americas in fairs, museums, and world expositions. These exhibitions claimed to offer enlightenment to the public, presenting exotic races as living specimens of anthropology. In truth, they were voyeuristic showcases of domination. Audiences lined up to gawk at men, women, and children transported from their homelands and placed in artificial native villages, dressed in costumes that suited European fantasies. The message was clear: Western civilization was superior, and the bodies of the colonized could be owned, studied, and consumed as curiosities. By the time Barnum brought his Human Zoo to Philadelphia in 1878, this European trend had been thriving for decades. He merely adapted it to the American appetite for sensational entertainment. Barnum's genius, if it can be called that, lay in his ability to merge the theatrical with the scientific. He understood that Americans loved to be entertained but also sought validation through the appearance of education. His exhibitions often masqueraded as opportunities to learn about science, history, or geography. Visitors were told they were not simply gawking at human oddities, they were expanding their knowledge of the world. Flyers described the displays in lofty terms, claiming that these living wonders provided insights into God's creation, the mysteries of evolution, or the diversity of humankind. The reality, of course, was that individuals with unique physical traits or different cultural backgrounds were reduced to objects of fascination, their humanity flattened into labels and caricatures. The horror of the Human Zoo concept resided in its ability to dehumanize under the guise of curiosity. Consider the exhibitions of indigenous peoples brought from remote parts of the world to stand before audiences who jeered, stared, and whispered. They were forced into mock tribal scenarios, complete with props that bore little resemblance to their actual cultures. Barnum exploited this same model, often billing his performers as savages or mysteries from distant lands, even when they were born and raised in America. An indigenous man might be rebranded as a warrior from the South Seas. A woman with a skin condition might be marketed as an exotic hybrid from a far-off jungle. Truth was irrelevant. What mattered was the narrative. Audiences wanted to believe they were seeing something foreign, dangerous, and extraordinary. Barnum also expanded the Human Zoo concept by including individuals with rare genetic or medical conditions. These performers were placed on equal footing with the so-called ethnological exhibits, creating a grotesque continuum of spectacle. Dwarfs, giants, albinos, and conjoined twins were displayed alongside families portrayed as tribal curiosities. By framing all of them as anomalies, whether cultural or biological, Barnum reinforced the idea that difference was inherently freakish, something to be stared at, studied, and laughed about. In doing so, he blurred the lines between natural science, colonial propaganda, and popular entertainment, packaging it all into a single, profitable spectacle. Philadelphia, with its intellectual pride and growing scientific institutions, was particularly susceptible to Barnum's framing. The city boasted universities, medical colleges, and societies dedicated to natural history. For many Philadelphians, attending Barnum's exhibition felt less like indulging in crude entertainment and more like participating in an educational event. The language of science gave legitimacy to their curiosity. Doctors and medical students were frequent attendees, some taking notes or sketching the performers as though cataloguing specimens. These actions lent an air of authority to what was, at its core, exploitation. The performers were not subjects of genuine study, they were props in a theatre of pseudoscience. The roots of this fascination ran deeper than mere entertainment. The late 19th century was an age of anxiety about identity, race, and progress. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution had unsettled traditional beliefs about humanity's origins. If humans had evolved from earlier species, then what did that mean for those who looked different, who did not fit the mold of the ideal body? Eugenics was beginning to take shape as a field, preaching the classification of superior and inferior stock. In this context, Barnum's Human Zoo reinforced societal hierarchies. By presenting individuals as curiosities, as examples of deviation, the exhibitions reassured audiences of their own normalcy and superiority. Looking at someone branded as a freak or savage was a way of looking into a distorted mirror, one that reflected the viewer's place at the top of an imagined ladder of humanity. But beneath the spectacle, the human cost was staggering. Those who were exhibited endured constant scrutiny, their lives reduced to performance. They were separated from their families, paraded in front of strangers, and subjected to daily indignities. Some embraced their roles, carving out a livelihood and even achieving fame. Others suffered in silence, trapped in contracts they could not escape. The audience saw only what Barnum wanted them to see, the surface of difference, stripped of context or individuality. Behind the curtains, the performers were ordinary people with fears, hopes, and private lives. Yet those truths were never part of the show. The human zoo concept also had broader implications for society's conscience. By normalizing the act of staring at difference, it taught audiences that exploitation was acceptable, even desirable. Children grew up seeing these exhibitions as harmless fun, never questioning the ethics behind them. Newspapers legitimized the shows by printing glowing advertisements and sensational reports. Clergy members sometimes condemned the spectacles, but their protests were often drowned out by the roar of public interest. Barnum's genius, once again, was in making exploitation not only profitable but fashionable. By the time the 1878 Philadelphia exhibition opened, the idea of the human zoo had already taken root in the Western imagination. Barnum's show was not an isolated event. It was part of a broader cultural movement that commodified human beings for the sake of spectacle. What made Philadelphia's exhibition particularly chilling was its timing. A city that had just celebrated human progress at the Centennial Exposition now willingly embraced an event that stripped away dignity for the sake of entertainment. The contradiction was stark, and yet few seemed troubled by it. Progress and exploitation walked hand in hand, and Barnum thrived in the shadows where they met. The origins of the human zoo reveal a pattern of cruelty dressed in the clothing of curiosity. It was not enough to conquer lands or subjugate peoples. They had to be put on display, turned into consumable wonders for paying audiences. Barnum's genius was to fuse this tradition with his trademark humbug, creating a spectacle that felt both educational and thrilling. But beneath the posters, the applause, and the gasps of wonder lay a simple, horrifying truth. The human zoo was never about understanding others. It was about reinforcing the power of those who watched over those who were forced to be seen. They came from every corner of the world, or at least, that's how Barnum told it. In truth, many of the individuals exhibited in Philadelphia in 1878 were born in the United States or in Europe, but Barnum's genius was in rebranding them as wonders from afar. To the audience, they were not people with families, histories, or identities. They were curiosities given dramatic titles, each name more theatrical than the last. This section of Barnum's Human Zoo was the most enticing for visitors, for here they could lay eyes upon what the posters promised were the strangest and most astonishing human beings alive. The lineup included those with rare genetic conditions, giants, dwarfs, conjoined twins, and people with severe deformities. Each was marketed with a mixture of awe and mockery. Philadelphia audiences were introduced to individuals like Chang and Iengi, the famous conjoined twins from Siam, whose very existence challenged the public's understanding of the human body. Though they had already achieved international fame before Barnum's Philadelphia show, the legend lived on in his exhibitions, their likenesses appearing in posters, pamphlets, and staged reenactments. To Barnum, their story was not one of resilience or humanity, but of spectacle, proof that nature itself could be twisted into a form of entertainment. Then there was General Tom Thumb, perhaps Barnum's most famous attraction. Born Charles Stratton in Connecticut, Tom Thumb had been discovered by Barnum at the age of 4 and thrust into a life of performance. By 1878, his fame had reached near mythic levels, having performed for royalty across Europe and married another little person, Lavinia Warren, in a ceremony that drew international headlines. Though Stratton himself was not present in every iteration of Barnum's traveling exhibitions by this period, his image and story were indispensable. He represented Barnum's ability to transform an individual into a living legend, one whose existence was inseparable from the myth created around him. Philadelphia crowds who didn't see Tom Thumb in person were nonetheless saturated with his image, his name, and his carefully curated identity. Among the most unsettling aspects of the exhibition were those marketed as exotic peoples. Entire families were transported, or claimed to have been transported, from distant lands and presented as living specimens of primitive humanity. In reality, some were indigenous Americans, Caribbean islanders, or even immigrants from within the United States, repackaged as representatives of far-off tribes. They were made to wear costumes, perform dances, and enact rituals scripted for the audience's amusement. These displays carried the veneer of anthropology, suggesting that the public was glimpsing authentic cultural practices. In truth, they were carefully staged deceptions designed to reinforce stereotypes of savagery and difference. For the people involved, it meant being stripped of their true identity and forced to inhabit a caricature created by Barnum's publicity machine. One such example was the exhibition of individuals labeled as Earth's rarest albino family. These were people with albinism, presented not as individuals with a genetic condition but as mystical beings with ghostly appearances. Barnum's marketing emphasized their unnatural whiteness, presenting them as neither fully human nor fully otherworldly, but something uncanny that hovered between. Spectators marveled at their pale skin and hair, whispering about curses, purity, or strange ancestry. To medical professionals in the audience, they were specimens. To the masses, they were something both fascinating and unsettling. For the family themselves, it was a life defined not by who they were, but by how the public reacted to their difference. Giants, too, held a special place in the public imagination. Men and women of unusual height were paraded on stage, often dressed in costumes that emphasized their towering stature. Some were genuinely afflicted with conditions like gigantism or acromegaly, while others were simply tall individuals exaggerated by clever marketing. Barnum ensured that their names carried an air of foreignness or mystery, the Colossus of the Orient or the Goliath of Patagonia. The specifics didn't matter to the audience. What mattered was that, for a few cents, they could stand before a person whose body seemed to break the rules of nature itself. In a world without cinema or digital media, this was a form of living magic. Equally captivating were the so-called tattooed savages, often sailors or individuals from marginalized backgrounds who had undergone extensive tattooing. In Barnum's shows, they were stripped of their actual histories and rebranded as tribal warriors from the South Pacific or Africa. The tattoos became props in a fabricated narrative of barbarism and danger, thrilling audiences who associated body art with the forbidden. For Philadelphians in 1878, who lived in a society where tattoos were rare and stigmatized, these individuals were living canvases of the exotic. Their bodies told stories, but not their own stories. Instead, Barnum wrote the script, and the performers played the parts. What united all of these oddities was Barnum's ability to weave their existence into a broader mythology. He gave them titles, costumes, and backstories that elevated their difference into spectacle. Newspapers printed exaggerated biographies, claiming noble bloodlines, mystical origins, or miraculous survival stories. Every detail was designed to maximize curiosity and ticket sales. Yet behind the posters and performances were real human beings, men and women who laughed, loved, and suffered like anyone else. For some, the stage offered financial independence and a kind of fame otherwise inaccessible. For others, it was a cage they could not escape, a life defined by other people's fascination with their bodies. Philadelphia's audiences, wide-eyed and eager, rarely paused to consider the truth. They accepted the stories, delighted in the exaggerations, and marveled at the supposed wonders before them. Each performer became a character in Barnum's larger theatre of humbug, their individuality erased beneath layers of marketing and spectacle. Yet the faint traces of their humanity sometimes pierced through, the flicker of a smile, the fatigue in their eyes, the unmistakable reminder that they were not myths or curiosities but flesh and blood human beings. In the grand tapestry of Barnum's Philadelphia exhibition, the arrival of these oddities was the centerpiece. They embodied the contradictions of the age: scientific curiosity masquerading as entertainment, exploitation disguised as opportunity, and cruelty cloaked in wonder. They were the stars of a stage they did not choose, caught between the fascination of the crowd and the machinery of Barnum's empire. And though their names and faces may have been forgotten by many, their presence in 1878 marked one of the most haunting chapters in the story of the human zoo. Behind the dazzling posters, the roaring crowds, and Barnum's booming proclamations, life for the men, women, and children on display was far more complex, and often far more painful, than the audience ever suspected. The Philadelphia exhibition in 1878 may have appeared to the public as a carnival of marvels, but for those exhibited, it was a strange existence suspended between opportunity and exploitation. On stage they were legends, giants, savages, mermaids, curiosities. Offstage, they were human beings living in cramped lodgings, struggling with loneliness, humiliation, and the weight of being constantly reduced to their differences. To understand the true cost of Barnum's human zoo, one must step away from the spotlight and peer into the shadows where the performers lived their daily lives. Contracts were at the center of this hidden world. Barnum was a shrewd businessman, and he drew up agreements that gave him immense control over his performers. Some contracts promised steady pay and lodging, a security that was rare for individuals who might otherwise be excluded from society and denied employment. Others, however, were exploitative to the extreme, with clauses that allowed Barnum to terminate agreements at will or to take the lion's share of earnings. In many cases, performers had little choice but to accept whatever terms were offered, as the world outside the exhibition offered few opportunities for survival. To be a curiosity was to be trapped in a paradox. The very condition that drew ridicule in the streets became the only means by which one could earn a living inside Barnum's empire. Living conditions varied greatly depending on a performer's level of fame. Those who had become stars, such as Tom Thumb or the Siamese twins Chang and Dianji, were afforded more comfortable accommodations and, in some cases, retained significant portions of their earnings. They traveled in relative luxury and sometimes enjoyed recognition and respect beyond the stage. But for the less celebrated oddities, life was far harsher. Many lodged in cheap boarding houses, shared cramped rooms with other performers, or slept in the backstage areas of exhibition halls. Privacy was scarce, and the pressure to maintain their unstaged personas even in their off hours was constant. Some performers were forced to wear costumes outside of showtime, blurring the line between performance and existence. To the public, they were never allowed to simply be themselves. They were always the giant, the freak, the savage. Psychological tolls were immense. Imagine living under the gaze of hundreds of strangers each day, their eyes scanning your body as though you were a specimen under glass. Performers were constantly subjected to pointing, whispering, and laughter. Some learned to harden themselves, adopting humor and bravado as shields against the cruelty of the crowd. Others internalized the ridicule, suffering quietly as their identities were reduced to the conditions of their bodies. Diaries and letters from some performers reveal the deep loneliness that came with fame built on exploitation. For every moment of applause, there were nights of silence, where the mask of spectacle fell away and left only a human being longing to be seen as more than an oddity. Yet the story was not entirely one of despair. Some performers discovered ways to reclaim power within Barnum's system. A few negotiated better pay, insisted on personal autonomy, or used their fame to secure marriages, friendships, and social connections that elevated their status beyond the stage. Tom Thumb, for example, leveraged his celebrity into wealth and independence, proving that under the right circumstances, the stage could offer a form of liberation. Others developed strong bonds with fellow performers, creating communities of solidarity that existed in the margins of the human zoo. For those who were constantly objectified, these relationships provided rare spaces where they could be themselves, free of the roles forced upon them. The darker side of this life, however, cannot be ignored. Exploitation often continued beyond the stage, with performers treated as property rather than people. When a performer fell ill or aged out of the spotlight, they were frequently discarded, their contracts terminated, and their fame forgotten. Some died in poverty, their bodies donated to medical schools or displayed posthumously as curiosities even in death. The story of Joyce Heth, whom Barnum exhibited as George Washington's supposed 161-year-old nurse and then dissected publicly after her death, remained a chilling reminder of how little dignity performers could expect once they ceased to generate profit. The performers were also subject to a unique kind of invisibility. While they were hypervisible on stage, celebrated as wonders and stared at with endless fascination, their actual voices were rarely heard. Newspaper interviews often put words in their mouths, shaping their stories to fit Barnum's preferred narrative. The public did not want to hear about their ordinary thoughts, dreams, or struggles. They wanted larger-than-life myths. Thus, performers were trapped in a double bind. They lived lives of constant visibility while remaining fundamentally unseen as individuals. In Philadelphia, as in every city the show visited, this dual reality persisted. By day, the performers dazzled and horrified crowds, playing roles scripted for them by Barnum's publicity machine. By night, they retreated into small rooms, nursing fatigue, loneliness, and sometimes quiet despair. A few might find comfort in community or small luxuries, but for many, life behind the curtain was a shadowed existence, haunted by the knowledge that their humanity had been traded for spectacle. To peer behind the curtains of Barnum's 1878 exhibition is to confront the true cost of spectacle. The audience saw only the surface, the laughter, the astonishment, the wonder. They did not see the contracts written in Barnum's favor, the weary faces once the gas lamps were extinguished, or the quiet tears shed in boarding house rooms. Barnum's genius was in ensuring that the public never thought to look deeper. He packaged difference as entertainment, and in doing so, he concealed the lives of those who made his empire possible. For the performers themselves, existence was a delicate balance of survival and performance, humanity and myth, all lived out behind the heavy velvet curtains of the human zoo. They filed in by the hundreds, sometimes by the thousands, eager to hand over a coin for the privilege of staring at another human being. Men in soot-stained coats straight from the factories, women in bustled dresses clasping their children's hands, students in tailored suits, and even Philadelphia's upper crust, who attended partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to be seen among the crowd, all found themselves shoulder to shoulder in Barnum's exhibition halls. The audience was as varied as the city itself, but they shared a common hunger, the desire to look upon the strange, the abnormal, the forbidden. The question that echoes across time is simple yet unsettling. Why did they watch? The first answer lies in pure curiosity. In an age before cinema, television, or the internet, people's exposure to difference was profoundly limited. Most had never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. To see a giant towering over the crowd, a pair of conjoined twins moving in eerie unison, or a so-called savage dressed in feathers and beads was to glimpse a world far larger and stranger than their own. For the price of a ticket, the audience could step into a theater of marvels where the extraordinary became accessible. This was not passive entertainment. It was an active, visceral encounter with the unknown, one that left visitors whispering about what they had seen long after they left the hall. But curiosity alone does not explain the intensity of the fascination. Underneath the marvel was a deep vein of fear. The Victorians lived in a world dominated by strict boundaries: normal and abnormal, civilized and savage, human and animal. Barnum's performers blurred those boundaries, challenging the audience's certainty about what was natural and what was monstrous. To look at someone whose body defied expectation was to peer into the chaos that lay beneath the surface of order. And yet, in staring at these figures, the crowd found reassurance. By labeling others as freaks, they reaffirmed their own place within the accepted definition of normality. The exhibition was as much about the audience's identity as it was about the performers. There was also the thrill of superiority. Watching the oddities was not only entertaining but also affirming. The act of staring was itself a performance of power, an assertion that those behind the railings were objects to be consumed, while those in the audience were the rightful consumers. This sense of control was intoxicating, particularly for working-class Philadelphians whose own lives were marked by hardship and instability. In Barnum's halls, even the poorest visitor could feel a momentary surge of superiority over someone more marginalized, more vulnerable, more visibly different. It was a cruel form of catharsis, a temporary release from the pressures of industrial life. The role of pseudoscience cannot be ignored either. The 19th century was an era of medical speculation and racial theory. Phrenologists, anthropologists, and physicians attended Barnum's shows under the pretense of study, measuring skulls, sketching profiles, and writing notes as though cataloging specimens. For the general audience, these displays of science lent credibility to their fascination. They weren't just staring for fun, they were participating in the advancement of knowledge, or so they believed. This veneer of legitimacy allowed curiosity to thrive without guilt. The spectacle was thus reframed as both entertainment and education, a strange mixture that made staring at another human being feel not only acceptable but respectable. Children, too, were central to the audience's fascination. Parents brought them along as both entertainment and instruction. Wide-eyed boys and girls pointed and giggled, their laughter mingling with gasps of shock. To them, the performers were fairy tale creatures come to life, giants, dwarfs, mermaids, and monsters. Yet these encounters also served as lessons, subtle reinforcements of social boundaries. Children learned what was normal by seeing what was branded abnormal. They internalized the hierarchy of bodies and identities long before they could fully understand it. Barnum's exhibitions did not merely entertain, they educated the next generation in ways that left lasting imprints on cultural attitudes. And then there was the undeniable allure of the forbidden. For all their claims of morality, Victorian audiences were fascinated by what they pretended to condemn. The grotesque, the deformed, the exotic, they embodied the taboo. To gaze upon them was to indulge in a kind of transgression, a safe flirtation with the macabre. Barnum understood this instinct well. His advertising deliberately emphasized the shocking nature of his oddities, promising sights that would horrify, astonish, and amaze. He invited his audiences to step close to the edge of decency, to peer into a world of strangeness that society otherwise tried to keep hidden. The thrill of breaking that taboo, without actually breaking the law, was part of the exhibition's irresistible pull. It is tempting to dismiss these audiences as ignorant relics of the past, but the truth is more uncomfortable. Their fascination was not so different from the instincts that drive modern audiences towards sensational television, internet spectacles, or viral videos of the bizarre. The medium has changed, but the hunger remains the same. The Philadelphia crowds of 1878 were not anomalies. They were human beings responding to a universal impulse, to look at what is strange, to define themselves against what they are not, and to take pleasure in the spectacle of difference. In the end, the crowd's fascination reveals as much about the viewers as it does about the viewed. Barnum's performers may have stood on stage, but the real show was in the audience's reactions, the laughter, the gasps, the whispered judgments. Their eyes betrayed the fears, desires, and contradictions of a society both enthralled and unsettled by what it could not fully comprehend. The people of Philadelphia came to the human zoo seeking wonder, but what they found staring back at them was a reflection of their own uneasy humanity. The line between science and spectacle was razor-thin in the 19th century, and nowhere was this more evident than in Barnum's human zoo. To the paying crowds in Philadelphia in 1878, Barnum's exhibition was an evening's diversion, a chance to marvel at the strange and the grotesque. But woven into the performance was a far more insidious layer, the appropriation of science to justify and legitimize exploitation. Doctors, anthropologists, and pseudoscientists flocked to these shows, eager to measure skulls, sketch unusual bodies, and jot notes in their journals. They claimed they were advancing knowledge, but in truth, they were participating in the same spectacle as everyone else, only cloaked in the authority of science. This was the age of classification. Inspired by Darwin's On the Origin of Species and earlier taxonomies of plants and animals, scholars were obsessed with organizing humanity into categories of normal and abnormal, civilized and primitive, fit and unfit. Barnum's performers became convenient case studies in this cultural obsession. A man of extraordinary height was not simply a tall individual, he was a specimen of gigantism, proof of nature's deviations. Conjoined twins were not simply siblings bound together by fate, they were medical marvels to be dissected, if not literally, then in the pages of journals. Individuals with albinism, dwarfs, and those with unusual skin conditions were drawn into the same framework, their lives reduced to biological curiosities. The exhibition stage doubled as a laboratory, and the audience became participants in an unspoken experiment of observation and judgment. Yet much of this so-called science was little more than speculation dressed up in formal language. Phrenology, for example, was wildly popular at the time. Practitioners claimed they could determine intelligence, morality, and character by feeling the bumps and ridges of the skull. Barnum eagerly embraced this fad, inviting phrenologists to examine his performers. When a giant skull measured larger than average, it was presented as evidence of savagery or limited intellect. When a dwarf's head was proportionally small, it was deemed proof of childlike behavior. These conclusions were entirely unfounded, but to the audience, they carried the weight of authority. Science was not simply present in Barnum's exhibition, It was weaponized to reinforce prejudice and hierarchy. Perhaps the most disturbing intersection between science and spectacle was the link to emerging ideas of eugenics. Though the eugenics movement would not fully take shape until the early 20th century, its roots were already visible in 1878. The obsession with categorizing human difference fed directly into ideas about breeding better humans and eliminating undesirable traits. Performers in Barnum's show were sometimes described in newspapers as degenerates or evolutionary throwbacks, terms that suggested they were less than fully human. These labels did not simply entertain the public, they informed policies and attitudes that would later have devastating consequences, from forced sterilizations to racial segregation laws. In this sense, Barnum's exhibition was not merely a spectacle of the moment, it was part of a longer history of scientific dehumanization. Medical students and professionals often attended these shows in groups, notebooks in hand, as if on a field trip. Some performers were prodded, measured, and questioned, their bodies treated as open books for others to read. Newspaper accounts sometimes describe these scenes with pride, portraying Philadelphia as a city of learning where even entertainment could serve science. But for the performers themselves, it was another layer of violation. They were not only stared at by gawking crowds but also dissected metaphorically by men in white coats, who stripped away their humanity in the name of knowledge. To be exhibited was one indignity, to be studied like an insect pinned to a board was another. The language of science also provided Barnum with a powerful marketing tool. Posters described the performers as rare specimens, living proofs, or remarkable deviations of nature. These phrases lent a veneer of legitimacy to what was, in reality, exploitation. Visitors could tell themselves that they were not simply indulging in morbid curiosity, they were learning. The show was not just entertainment, it was education. This framing made it easier for respectable citizens to attend without shame. A doctor could justify his presence as research. A parent could tell themselves they were teaching their child about the diversity of the human species. Barnum understood the value of this framing perfectly, and he wielded it with ruthless effectiveness. The intersection of spectacle and science was also evident in the way racial theories were propagated. Ethnological exhibits, where families from Africa, Asia, or the Americas were displayed in fabricated native villages, were often presented as living anthropology. Scientists claimed these exhibits allowed them to study primitive races in their natural state, even though the costumes, behaviors, and settings were entirely staged. Barnum capitalized on these ideas, presenting indigenous peoples and immigrants as examples of racial otherness. Their difference was not just physical, it was framed as cultural and evolutionary. Audiences left believing they had glimpsed a hierarchy of humanity, with themselves firmly at the top. Philadelphia's intellectual climate made it fertile ground for these ideas. The city's medical schools were among the most prestigious in the country, and its scientific societies prided themselves on advancing knowledge. Yet the eagerness with which scholars participated in Barnum's exhibition reveals a darker truth. Science in this period was not immune to spectacle. It was often complicit in reinforcing the very prejudices that entertainment exploited. The boundary between the lecture hall and the sideshow tent was porous, and sometimes non-existent. The performers themselves navigated this scientific scrutiny in complex ways. Some embraced it, hoping that being studied might lend them credibility or even protection. Others resented it deeply, recognizing that they were being reduced to objects rather than acknowledged as people. For many, it was simply another unavoidable aspect of a life defined by performance. They had no control over how their bodies were described, interpreted, or categorized. Their lives were filtered through the lenses of science and spectacle alike, and in both cases, their humanity was obscured. Looking back, the most chilling aspect of this intersection is how normalized it was. Audiences did not see a conflict between science and entertainment. They saw them as complementary. The lecture and the laugh, the measurement and the gasp, the notebook and the ticket stub, all were part of the same experience. Barnum's genius was not only in creating spectacle but in enlisting the authority of science to make it palatable. He transformed cruelty into curiosity, and curiosity into profit. In Philadelphia in 1878, as gas lamps glowed over the crowded exhibition halls, the spectators may have believed they were participating in something grander than mere entertainment. They thought they were learning about the mysteries of nature, peering into the secrets of evolution, and witnessing the diversity of the human race. What they were truly witnessing, however, was the fusion of spectacle and pseudoscience into a single, dangerous force, one that dehumanized the performers while shaping societal attitudes for generations to come. Science and spectacle were not separate in Barnum's world. They were two sides of the same coin, spun endlessly for profit, no matter the cost to those trapped in the gaze. Scandal followed Barnum like a shadow, and by the time his exhibition reached Philadelphia in 1878, the chorus of critics had grown louder than ever. Newspapers buzzed not only with advertisements and breathless accounts of the curiosities on display, but also with pointed editorials questioning the morality of the human zoo. Clergy members thundered from pulpits that such shows degraded the dignity of man, reducing God's creation to fodder for laughter. Social reformers wrote impassioned letters warning that Barnum's empire thrived on cruelty disguised as amusement. And yet, as with every controversy in his career, the backlash only seemed to draw more people through the doors. For Barnum, scandal was not a threat, it was a tool. Philadelphia's press was divided. Some papers championed Barnum as a genius of entertainment, a man who had transformed simple oddities into global wonders. They argued that his shows offered both amusement and education, that the city should be proud to host such a grand spectacle. But others were less kind. One editorial compared the exhibition to a form of public degradation, insisting that no civilized society should take pleasure in the suffering or humiliation of others. Still others accused Barnum of fraud, alleging that many of the performers were misrepresented or exaggerated. Was the tattooed man truly a savage warrior, or merely a sailor with a fondness for ink? Was the giant really of foreign blood, or simply an unusually tall farmhand from Ohio? These questions filled columns and tavern conversations alike, but rather than undermining Barnum, they added fuel to his carefully stoked fire of controversy. Religious leaders were particularly incensed. To them, the human zoo represented a corruption of Christian values, an exploitation of the weak for the profit of the powerful. Sermons denounced the exhibition as sinful, warning congregants that gawking at those whom God had made different was an act of mockery against the divine itself. Yet even as they condemned the shows, many could not resist describing the oddities in vivid detail, descriptions that only heightened curiosity among listeners. Parishioners who left church on Sunday shaking their heads at the preacher's words might find themselves standing in Barnum's ticket line by Monday evening, eager to see for themselves what all the fuss was about. Medical professionals, too, contributed to the scandal. Some accused Barnum of perpetuating pseudoscience, of twisting genuine medical conditions into sensational fables. Doctors published rebuttals in journals, pointing out the exaggerations in Barnum's claims. If he presented an individual as the missing link between man and beast, scientists countered with measured arguments about biology. Yet even these rebuttals inadvertently lent credibility to the show. By debating Barnum's exhibits, the scientific community acknowledged them, keeping the performers, and Barnum's name, at the center of public discourse. For the average citizen, the disagreement itself was part of the allure. If the doctors and the newspapers couldn't agree on what was true, then surely it was worth the price of admission to see the mystery firsthand. Perhaps the most poignant voices in the backlash came from those who empathized with the performers themselves. Reformers argued that Barnum's human zoo stripped individuals of their dignity, forcing them to live as spectacles rather than as people. Some worried that children growing up in a culture that normalized such displays would learn to mock difference rather than respect it. A few even called for laws to regulate or ban the exhibition of human beings for entertainment. But in 1878, such calls were easily drowned out by the roar of popular demand. The public's appetite for spectacle was too strong, and the machinery of profit too powerful. Barnum himself was never rattled by criticism. In fact, he courted it. He often responded to scandals with playful defiance, turning outrage into marketing copy. If a newspaper called one of his exhibits a fraud, he printed the accusation alongside his advertisements, knowing that skepticism only sharpened curiosity. If preachers condemned him, he invited them to attend, daring them to see the show before passing judgment. In Barnum's world, there was no such thing as bad publicity. Every critic became an unwitting promoter, every scandal a spark that kept the fire of public interest alive. And yet, beneath the showman's bravado, real tension simmered. Lawsuits occasionally arose over broken contracts or accusations of mistreatment. Performers sometimes rebelled against the roles they were forced to play, pushing back against the exaggerations that distorted their identities. Whispers of exploitation spread among reform-minded citizens, who feared that Barnum's empire was a symbol of America's moral decay. These moments revealed cracks in the glittering facade, reminding audiences that the human zoo was not simply a harmless diversion but a deeply contested institution. For the people of Philadelphia, the scandal was part of the experience. Attending Barnum's show was not just about witnessing the oddities, it was about being part of a cultural debate, a conversation that stretched from taverns to churches to dinner tables. Some came to scoff, others to marvel, but all came. Scandal created a magnetic pull, a sense that something dangerous and thrilling was unfolding. To miss it would be to miss the event of the season, and so even the most strident critics could not stop the flow of tickets. In retrospect, the backlash against Barnum's Philadelphia exhibition was an early glimpse of a larger moral reckoning that would come in the decades ahead. By the early 20th century, the sideshow tradition would begin to crumble under the weight of changing values, disability rights movements, and shifting forms of entertainment. But in 1878, the moral outrage was not enough to topple Barnum. If anything, it strengthened him, proving once again that his true genius was not just in staging spectacles, but in transforming scandal itself into a spectacle worth buying. By the time the curtain began to fall on the era of Barnum's Human Zoo, the world itself was shifting in ways that even the great showman could not fully control. In 1878, when Philadelphia played host to the spectacle, the public appetite for oddities seemed insatiable. Yet, within a few decades, the very foundation of the sideshow tradition would begin to erode, undermined by changes in culture, technology, and morality. What had once been the pinnacle of entertainment would slowly come to be seen as a shameful relic of a less enlightened age. The collapse of the Human Zoo was not sudden. It was a gradual unraveling, one woven from threads of social reform, scientific advancement, and the rise of new entertainments that left Barnum's model looking increasingly outdated. The first force of collapse came from shifting moral sensibilities. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, reform movements began to reshape the cultural landscape. Advocates for disability rights, social welfare, and human dignity challenged the notion that difference should be paraded for profit. While such ideas were still nascent in the late 1800s, the seeds were being planted. Religious leaders continued their denunciations, but now their voices were joined by educators and reformers who argued that exhibiting human beings as curiosities was incompatible with a society that claimed to value progress and compassion. The very language that once framed oddities as wonders of nature began to sound cruel, even barbaric, to a growing segment of the public. Science, too, played a paradoxical role in the decline. In the 19th century, pseudoscience had lent legitimacy to Barnum shows, with phrenologists and racial theorists eagerly measuring and categorizing performers. But as medical knowledge advanced, many of these claims were debunked. Conditions like albinism, gigantism, and dwarfism came to be understood in medical rather than mystical terms. What had once been presented as evidence of savagery or degeneration was increasingly recognized as the result of biological variation. For a society enthralled by progress and science, this shift undermined the aura of mystery that sustained the Human Zoo. If a performer's condition could be explained in a textbook, the spectacle lost some of its allure. What had once been framed as proof of divine punishment or evolutionary throwbacks was now something for the doctor's office, not the stage. Technology delivered another blow. The rise of cinema at the turn of the 20th century revolutionized entertainment. Moving pictures could offer wonders that no live exhibition could match, transporting audiences into distant lands, replaying extraordinary feats, and presenting spectacles on a scale far beyond what could be achieved in a sideshow tent. For the first time, people could witness the strange and the spectacular without leaving their neighborhoods. Nickelodeons and movie palaces began drawing crowds away from dime museums and traveling exhibitions, leaving Barnum's successors struggling to compete. Even those who still craved the bizarre increasingly found it on film reels, where the strange could be viewed in private, away from the moral scrutiny that live sideshows provoked. Vaudeville also rose as a dominant form of popular entertainment. Unlike Barnum's exhibitions, vaudeville emphasized comedy, music, dance, and variety acts. It promised spectacle without the taint of exploitation, at least in the eyes of its audience. Families who once might have attended Barnum's shows now took their children to vaudeville theaters, where laughter replaced the uneasy fascination of the freak show. In a culture that was becoming increasingly sensitive to respectability and social reform, vaudeville offered the safer option. The raw hunger for human oddities began to look less like innocent fun and more like cruelty, and the public began to vote with their feet. At the same time, performers themselves started to push back. Some had carved out lives of financial independence and fame, using the stage as a platform for agency. Others, however, resented the roles forced upon them, and as public attitudes shifted, they began to demand recognition as individuals rather than curiosities. A few even left the sideshow circuit altogether, finding alternative livelihoods or retreating into quieter lives away from spotlight. As the performers asserted their humanity, it became harder for audiences to ignore the exploitation inherent in the spectacle. What had once seemed like entertainment now looked increasingly like degradation. The decline of Barnum's human zoo was also fueled by the rise of activism on behalf of marginalized communities. The early disability rights movement challenged stereotypes and fought against the reduction of individuals to mere curiosities. Though progress was slow and uneven, the growing insistence on dignity and equality began to shift cultural norms. In this context, the human zoo appeared not only outdated but actively harmful. The very existence of such shows became a target for reform, lumped together with other social ills like child labor, poverty wages, and unsafe factories. What reformers sought was not merely the improvement of conditions for performers, but the eradication of the practice altogether. Still, the collapse was gradual. Sideshows lingered well into the 20th century, often attached to circuses or traveling fairs. But their cultural position weakened steadily. No longer central attractions, they became curiosities on the margins, attracting fewer crowds and more criticism. Laws regulating the exhibition of human beings were passed in some states, and even where such laws did not exist, public opinion increasingly frowned on the practice. By the mid-20th century, the freak show as Barnum had built it was in steep decline, remembered less as a marvel and more as a scandal. Barnum himself, of course, did not live to see the full collapse of his empire's darker elements. He died in 1891, still celebrated as America's greatest showman, his legacy a mixture of ingenuity, audacity, and exploitation. But the world he left behind was already shifting. Philadelphia, which had once lined up to see his human zoo, would eventually look back with a mixture of fascination and unease. What had once been embraced as thrilling spectacle would later be condemned as a dark stain on the city's cultural history. The collapse of the human zoo was not merely the end of a form of entertainment, it was the beginning of a broader reckoning. It forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of curiosity, the ethics of spectacle, and the treatment of those who are different. Though exploitation did not vanish, it merely changed form. The decline of Barnum's model marked a turning point. It was the slow death of an institution that had thrived on dehumanization, undone by the very forces of progress and morality it had once disguised itself within. In the echo of that collapse, the silence left behind spoke volumes. The applause that had once roared through Barnum's halls faded into memory, replaced by whispers of shame and regret. The human zoo, once a symbol of entertainment's boundless possibilities, became instead a cautionary tale of how far society will go in its hunger for spectacle, and how far it must come to recognize the humanity hidden beneath the stage lights. The legacy of Barnum's human zoo did not vanish when the sideshows began to decline. Instead, it transformed, mutating into new forms that still echo in modern life. Though audiences in Philadelphia in 1878 might have believed they were witnessing something unique to their age, the deeper truth is that the impulses that drove people to gawk at Barnum's oddities are timeless. The packaging has changed, no longer velvet curtains and gaslit halls, but the underlying appetite for spectacle, for staring at difference, for consuming the lives of others as entertainment, remains as alive today as it was in Barnum's time. The human zoo collapsed, but its spirit still lingers, hidden in plain sight. One of the clearest echoes lies in reality television. Programs that invite viewers to peer into the intimate lives of strangers carry more in common with Barnum's exhibitions than most care to admit. Shows that highlight unusual lifestyles, extreme medical conditions, or eccentric personalities continue to draw millions of viewers. Participants are often given exaggerated storylines, nicknames, or identities crafted by producers to maximize curiosity and drama. The public consumes these images with the same mix of fascination, judgment, and superiority that Philadelphia audiences once directed at Barnum's performers. Just as a giant or a dwarf was rebranded as a mythical figure, modern participants are cast as archetypes: the villain, the oddball, the spectacle. The human element is flattened into a performance for the masses. The medical world, too, bears the scars of Barnum's legacy. Throughout the 20th century, individuals with unusual conditions were often studied without consent, treated as specimens rather than patients. Even today, television specials and documentaries sometimes veer uncomfortably close to exploitation, presenting individuals with rare disorders as curiosities rather than human beings. The camera lingers on their bodies, their differences, their struggles, inviting viewers to marvel at their condition rather than to empathize with their lives. It is the same voyeuristic impulse, dressed up in the modern language of education. The thin line between awareness and exploitation remains as fragile now as it was under Barnum's gaslights. The internet has accelerated this legacy in unprecedented ways. Viral videos and social media posts thrive on the bizarre, the shocking, The strange. Images of individuals with unusual appearances or behaviors can be shared to millions in a matter of hours, often without context or consent. Comment sections become digital exhibition halls where strangers gawk, laugh, and pass judgment. In this sense, the human zoo has not disappeared. It has simply migrated online, accessible 24 hours a day to anyone with a smartphone. The anonymity of the internet intensifies the cruelty, stripping away even the minimal accountability that came with buying a ticket and standing in a crowd. The performers no longer need Barnum to script their identities. The digital audience does it for them, crafting narratives, memes, and mockeries out of real lives. The echoes of Barnum's exploitation are also found in the way modern society commodifies tragedy and trauma. True crime documentaries, sensational news stories, and shock journalism feed on the same instinct to peer into the misfortune of others. Audiences consume these stories with a mixture of horror and fascination, drawn not only to the events themselves but to the humans suffering at their core. The line between empathy and entertainment is constantly blurred, much as it was when Philadelphia citizens filed into Barnum's halls to marvel at those presented as freaks and savages. The packaging has become slicker, the technology more advanced, but the hunger it feeds remains the same. Yet, there is also a counter-legacy: resistance, critique, and reclamation. Just as some of Barnum's performers found ways to assert agency within the confines of exploitation, modern individuals subjected to voyeurism sometimes reclaim their narratives. Activists with disabilities, marginalized communities, and those once labeled as other have used platforms like social media to tell their own stories, to demand recognition of their humanity rather than their novelty. Documentaries created with empathy and collaboration have sought to humanize rather than sensationalize, to reveal the person behind the condition rather than reducing them to it. These efforts are part of an ongoing struggle to confront the legacy of exploitation and to create a culture that values understanding over spectacle. The legacy of Barnum's human zoo also lingers in language. Terms like freak show have entered everyday speech, often without awareness of their historical weight. The casual use of such phrases reflects how deeply ingrained the concept of human spectacle has become in cultural consciousness. Even the word oddity, once used to label Barnum's performers, persists in describing anything strange or unusual. The shadows of Barnum's vocabulary still color the way society talks about difference. In Philadelphia itself, the memory of Barnum's exhibition remains a haunting reminder of the city's complicity in the darker sides of entertainment history. Just 2 years after the Centennial Exposition celebrated human progress and invention, thousands of Philadelphians flocked to see a spectacle that commodified human difference. The contradiction is stark and instructive. It reveals how easily progress can coexist with exploitation, how society can celebrate dignity in one breath and strip it away in the next. That contradiction still exists in modern forms of entertainment, where the rhetoric of awareness and inclusion often masks the perpetuation of voyeurism and spectacle. Perhaps the most unsettling echo of Barnum's legacy is the realization that audiences today are not so different from those who crowded the gaslit halls in 1878. We may pride ourselves on being more enlightened, more compassionate, more aware of human rights. And yet, we still click on the viral video, binge the shocking documentary, and tune into the reality show built on exaggeration and humiliation. The appetite for spectacle has not died, it has adapted. Barnum's ghost lingers in every screen we stare into, every headline that sensationalizes difference, every moment we forget the humanity behind the story. The legacy of exploitation is not just a historical curiosity, it is a mirror. To study Barnum's human zoo is to confront our own complicity, to ask whether we have truly outgrown the instinct to turn human lives into entertainment. The uncomfortable truth is that we have not. We have simply modernized it, digitized it, and globalized it. Barnum may have died in 1891, but his lessons about profit, curiosity, and spectacle live on, stitched into the fabric of modern culture. His human zoo has collapsed, but its echoes still reverberate, reminding us that the line between fascination and exploitation is one we continue to blur. The curtain falls, the lamps dim, and the echoes of applause fade into silence. Yet the story of Barnum's human zoo does not end neatly when the crowds go home. It lingers, a shadow stretched across history, haunting us with questions we cannot easily answer. In Philadelphia in 1878, thousands of men, women, and children paid to witness what they were told was the greatest collection of living curiosities on earth. They left with memories of giants, dwarfs, tattooed savages, and faces marked by difference, but beneath those memories lay something darker, a complicity that bound them to a system of exploitation. To look back now is not simply to examine a relic of entertainment history, It is to stare into a dark mirror, one that reflects the very essence of human curiosity, cruelty, and the hunger for spectacle. What made Barnum's Philadelphia exhibition so powerful, and so disturbing, was the way it wove together entertainment, science, and morality into a single, seamless performance. It was never just a show. It was a ritual of identity-making, a chance for audiences to measure themselves against those deemed abnormal. It was also a distortion of science, where phrenologists and pseudo-experts lent false legitimacy to prejudice. And it was a moral crossroads, where every ticket purchased was a silent endorsement of turning people into products. The human zoo thrived not only because of Barnum's genius for promotion but because society itself was willing to embrace it. The applause in those halls belonged not only to Barnum but to the collective will of a culture that found fascination in the suffering of others. The performers themselves, caught in the center of this whirlwind, lived lives defined by contradiction. Some gained wealth, fame, and a degree of autonomy they might never have otherwise achieved. Others were crushed under the weight of ridicule, discarded when they lost their novelty, or remembered only as curiosities rather than as people. Behind the curtain, their stories reveal the human cost of spectacle, loneliness, exploitation, and the constant burden of being reduced to a label. They were both celebrated and dehumanized, admired and pitted, made into legends yet denied their own voices. Their experiences remind us that exploitation is rarely simple. It is a web of opportunity entangled with cruelty, choice intertwined with coercion. The audiences of 1878 came to Barnum's exhibition for many reasons: curiosity, fear, superiority, the thrill of the forbidden. But whatever their motives, their presence kept the system alive. They justified their fascination with the language of education, science, or even morality, convincing themselves that they were not complicit in cruelty. Yet the truth is inescapable. By buying a ticket, by laughing or gasping, by pointing or whispering, they helped sustain a culture that profited from the dehumanization of others. In this sense, the human zoo was not only a reflection of Barnum's ambition, it was a reflection of society's willingness to look away from suffering so long as it was entertaining. The collapse of the human zoo in the early 20th century was not the end of this story but merely its transformation. Advances in science stripped away the aura of mystery, reform movements challenged the morality of exploitation, and new technologies offered fresher forms of spectacle. Yet the appetite that fueled Barnum's empire did not vanish. It resurfaced in vaudeville, in cinema, in reality television, and on the internet. Each era reinvented the human zoo in new clothes, proving that the instincts which drew crowds to Philadelphia in 1878 remained deeply embedded in the human psyche. The stage may have changed, but the gaze, the hungry, consuming gaze of the audience, has not. This is the dark mirror of entertainment. It shows us not only what we watch but why we watch. To stare at Barnum's oddities was to confront the boundaries of normality and to take comfort in being on the safe side of that divide. To binge a reality show today, or to click on a viral video of someone's pain or difference, is to participate in the same act, even if we disguise it with the language of curiosity or awareness. The human zoo forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Do we seek out the strange to understand it, or to reassure ourselves of our own place in the world? When does curiosity become cruelty? And how much of our entertainment is built, even now, on the suffering or humiliation of others? Barnum himself famously said, "The people like to be humbugged." In many ways, he was right. We enjoy illusions, exaggerations, and stories that make the world feel larger and stranger than it is. But what Barnum never admitted, or perhaps never cared to admit, was the cost of those illusions. Humbug is harmless when it is a mermaid made of papier-mâché and fish bones. It becomes something far more sinister when it is a human life reduced to a spectacle. The Philadelphia exhibition of 1,878 stands as proof of how easily humbug can become exploitation when profit and curiosity collide. And yet, there is something hopeful in the reckoning that followed. The collapse of the human zoo was, in part, a sign that society can change, that cruelty once normalized can later be recognized as unacceptable. The performers who lived through it left behind traces of their humanity, photographs, memoirs, interviews, that remind us they were more than the roles forced upon them. Their legacy is not only one of exploitation but also of resilience. They survived in the face of ridicule, they carved out lives in the margins of spectacle, and in some cases, they even turned Barnum's machinery of exploitation into a vehicle for their own empowerment. In Philadelphia's gaslit halls in 1878, the applause rang loud, the posters promised wonders, and the crowds left astonished. But beneath that spectacle lay a story far more haunting, one that continues to echo in our own time. The human zoo was never just about the oddities on display. It was about us, the audience, and what we are willing to accept in the name of entertainment. It was about the shadows we ignore when curiosity outweighs compassion, the compromises we make when wonder comes at the cost of dignity. The story of Barnum's Human Zoo is not merely a chapter in history. It is a cautionary tale. It warns us that progress does not erase cruelty, that curiosity can mask complicity, and that spectacle often thrives on suffering. To look back on 1878 is to confront the uncomfortable truth that the hunger for the strange, the different, the forbidden, is still with us. The only question is whether we choose to indulge it as the Philadelphians once did, or whether we learn to see the humanity behind the spectacle. The curtain has fallen, but the mirror remains. And when we gaze into it, we do not only see Barnum's oddities, we see ourselves.